Hello, I'm Kevin Rogers. Hello, I'm Kevin Rogers. I'm the Director of Reasonable Faith Adelaide. And tonight, I welcome Senior Tom Daly, who's going to speak to us on a book called Dominion by Tom Holland and the Making of the Western Mind. So I'll now hand it over to Tom, and I'll just start the sharing.
Thanks. I got that. Did you start the recording? All good. Look at this. We got the text sorted out this week. Hey, guys, thanks for coming. It's going to be a dense talk, so I thought we might as well start off on the right foot. And I'm going to start with a story. And we're going to be talking about Tom Holland's book, Dominion, tonight. And as part of the intro, I'll give you the story. I'm going to do a little bit of reading. I'm trying to really give you a flavour of what Tom Holland is arguing, and the force with which he argues it, and why that's even made more forceful, because he's actually an agnostic, can't bring himself to be a believer. And then we'll go through some of the observations and his history, but I think that it really is applicable to today. It's history, and yet it's not history. It's history, and yet it's affecting very much what we're all living day to day. It's affecting so many things. But look, let's get into it with a story. There's a young monk. He arrives at, and excuse me while I have my head down reading this, but a young monk arrives at a monastery. He's assigned to helping other monks in copying the old canons and laws by hand, and of course we know how they all did it by hand. He notices, however, that all the monks are copying from copies, which is a concern, and not from the original manuscript. So the new monk goes to the head abbot to question this, and he pointed out that if someone made even a slight error in the first copy, that would never be picked up. Okay, and in fact that error would be continued at all the subsequent copies. The head monkey says, well, I guess that's the abbot, right? But anyway, he says, we've been copying from copies for centuries, but you know, you make a good point. It's always worth checking. He goes down to the dark caves underneath the monastery where the original manuscripts are held and archived in a locked vault that hasn't been opened for hundreds of years. Hours go by and nobody sees the old abbot. So the young monk gets worried and goes down to look for him, and he sees him banging his head against the wall and wailing. He's in serious distress, and he's just crying out, "We missed the R. We missed the R." And he's bruised, he's bloody and bruised, and he's crying uncontrollably. And the young monk asks, "Father, what's wrong?" And he said in a choking voice, the word was celebrate. So that might be the lightest this story gets this evening. I got that from a friend who you won't be surprised as a grandpa. Gary sent me that in writing there, so I'm blaming him. I want to position this talk. This is third of three. I talked last November about the beliefs of unbelievers, the examined and examined beliefs. We're all believers. We end up thinking in a post-Christian secular world that we have reason and the church has faith, right? It turns out to be that's really not true. And we really went into that. I love Ricky Gervais. Somehow I ended up being on his Facebook feed or whatever. And he talks about how people can choose to be offended if they like, and they can choose to be deluded if they like, right? And then he goes into a new period of his life where he's into animal rights and he's become a vegan. And he makes comments about how you should be kind to animals and you shouldn't eat animals and stuff like that. And then ironically, he expects me to think that he's done anything but say, boo animal murder. Like, what possible meaning can he have when he said that it's all relative anyway? for years. His humour is awesome. He's a very intelligent man. How do we explain this? Well, he hasn't really examined his worldview. He just hasn't looked at it. Then we looked at that in the surprising rebirth of God with my last talk a few months ago, and what happens when naturalism, this belief that there's only time, space, energy, and matter, because we can't prove that is. So it's a belief. We can't prove that that's all there is. So what happens when purpose and meaning wane as a result of whole populations actually taking either examined or even unexamined that assumption, that belief that there is in existence only space, time, energy, and matter? It certainly doesn't explain beauty, truth, goodness, truth, and beauty. Do they exist? So we looked at what happens to the population and what's happening around us, particularly with younger generations, and it turns out particularly with males. Some odd stuff coming out of Finland, and we now see in Australia that there's starting to be more males going to church in Australia, or at least new returning to church, than there are females. You know, the church since its inception has largely been female and largely not white. So this is interesting. Where are we today? Dominion. We're going to look at Tom Holland's tome, 600-page tome on how we live in 2,000 years of Christian history. And the more we assume it, the less we notice it. So talk number one was about atheist materialism, and it's the air we breathe. Talk number two is Justin Brierley, trying to feature and demonstrate how we're living in a non-story, and that's starting to break down, and that we might need a true larger story. It might be that we live in a larger story, and maybe our natures are telling us that. I gave the example of Dominion being influential. I alluded to this in the last talk, and Ayaan Hirsi Ali was a which Tunisian, I think, don't hang me on that, refugee to Europe, became staunchly atheistic, very anti-religion, having escaped female genital, well, she underwent female genital mutilation in the Islamic world, got to Holland, I believe, and then to the US, where she really became the fifth horseman of the apocalypse, along with Hitchens, Harris, Dennett, and Dawkins. And it was, I think, Glenn Scrivener, an apologist and pastor in the US, UK, who said she'd been Tom Holland pilled. Think blue pill and red pill from the Matrix. And anyway, she and her intellectual, I can't remember which university he's at, but public intellectual husband are now going to church each week. Her conversion is really quite a story. And I gave this link here. I'll post these slides to SlideShare and from my 3 talks, and you'll be able to find the links here. She initially started giving interviews after she said, "Why I'm now a Christian," and it really was an influence from Tom Holland's book, but it sounded like it was cultural, like, wow, we need the cultural Christianity in the West to hold off the forces of Islam and other forces. But as she got deeper and deeper into it, you realise that this is a woman who got to the end of herself and needed something that was beyond anything that anybody else could provide, including lots and lots of therapy. So Dominion, Tom Holland. It's a tome, as I said, 600 odd pages, but it's a really readable. Here's one of the summaries that I like about it from Tim Keller in a Gospel and Life article from a number of years ago. And Holland punctures common myths about Christianity and secularism. In no way does Holland let the church off the hook. I'm not going to say more about that in a minute. for its innumerable failures. He doesn't let the church off the hook for its innumerable failures, nor will he let secular people live with the illusion that their values are self-evident. That almost actually encapsulates Holland's argument from the 600-page book. So I've just saved you a lot of time reading, and you can go home. We can finish there. But actually, I will encourage you to read it. So that's really a summary of the book. Through 2,000 years of history, he shows how we got here. But I thought it'd be fun to ask Metalama, which is one of the AI engines, along with Claude, along with ChatGPT, this is the Meta one, the Facebook one, right? And theirs is actually really interesting, but that's a whole different talk. Holland argues Western values such as human rights, individualism, separation of church and state have their roots in Christianity. I was actually surprised that Metalama gave me that summary. Because they trained them very much not to give that sort of support, if you like, to Christianity. And I'll give you an idea of that in a minute. He strongly challenges the idea that these values are solely the product of the Enlightenment or ancient Greek and Roman civilizations. I asked Metalama to take the opposite position. It was wishy-washy, actually, and I haven't included it because it wasn't really awesome. It didn't give a lot of it didn't give a lot of force. And in fact, I'll make the comment now, even I have it on the slide later, I haven't seen a huge amount of pushback to Tom Holland's book. I think if this book had been 20 years earlier, it wouldn't have anywhere near the influence that it actually is having in academia and the arts. Key themes: rise of Christianity, impact of Christianity and Western values. That's just there to show you what Metalama actually put up. We're going to explore some of that. But this talk is largely about our ideas of good and bad. Brian and I know, and others have done talks about whether objective truth, whether objective good and bad actually exist. That's not the focus of this talk. It's about whether what we think is good and bad today is a product of 2,000 years. Okay. Now that's mostly, I couldn't resist. I have some observations later. And the talk is not, as I've mentioned, as Tim Keller does a great job of pointing out, it's not based on the tragic failings of the church. And nor is Tom Holland ignorant of these things. They're in there, all the warts and all. And I really recommend Bullies and Saints by John Dixon, who's now at Wheaton College in the US. That is an awesome book if you want to be both challenged, and it overlaps a lot with what Tom Holland is writing about. You'll see that in a minute. Holland makes strong claims, stronger than those of Metalama, actually. We are goldfish swimming in Christian waters. Now, I think that's channeling C.S. Lewis. So I think Lewis in Mere Christianity, I think it was, somebody can probably correct me if it wasn't, but he said we don't actually, he asked, would a goldfish know what wetness is? So would somebody of 2,000 years of Christendom actually understand that they're swimming in 2,000 years of the waters of Christendom? And he claims secular humanism is a product of Christendom and enabled by Christian teaching and ultimately the church. He makes a strong argument for this throughout the book and through some of the later chapters. So profound has been the impact of Christianity on the development of Western civilization that has come to be hidden from view. I have some resources from Glenn Scrivener at the end of this book, a podcast that I just listened to about the assisted dying bill. And Glenn Scrivener gives an awesome objective view about how Christianity, who is about the poor, the weak, the disabled, has been sort of bifurcated into this, yes, still the poor, the marginalised, the weak and the failed, but it's not the same thing. And a boss I used to have at Sun Microsystems asked if a can of Coke had 2 drops of deadly poison added to it, just minute drops, was it still actually a can of Coke, or was it denatured? Was it actually essentially something else? And I think that's the thing that I'll point you to some resources on from Glenn Scrivener. And this really got me. All these are quotes from the book, right? One really clear indication today of how effective or how enormous has been the effect of Christianity on our modern culture is almost the reverse of the one more God argument from atheists, right? I think Christopher Hitchens was famous for this one. You don't believe in Thor and Zeus and Jupiter. And he said, I just go one God more. Michael Shermer from the UK Humanist Association, he often uses that one. This is almost taking that same concept and saying, hang on, why don't any of our atheist secular, why don't our news shows, why don't they take time bagging Zeus or Jupiter well, because actually Christianity was so formed us, do we assume actually monotheism? We're so formed by Christendom that we just assume monotheism. Sure, there's an argument there that we got there from science. Holland argues that, yeah, the church had about a 2000, what was it, a 1700-year head start or something? Anyway, if Tom Holland's arguments are true, then ironically, scientific materialism, talk number 1 that I referred to, is also a Christian legacy. And that should be something that we take and think about seriously, as is some of his other arguments, and which we'll get to, particularly regarding Catholicism. He makes the point throughout the book that the teachings of Paul, that there's neither male nor female, Greek nor Jew, slave nor free, and I think I butchered that, sorry, but you get the idea. And the fact that the most powerful would die for the least powerful, he said, it is really hard to actually explain, and he takes 600 pages to try and explain how cataclysmic that is from the alien world that he found in Greek and Roman antiquity. And another thing, and this is Glenn Scrivener's book, another thing that sort of highlights the impact of Holland's claims about the Christian waters we swim in is that in almost every criticism we hear of the church, of Christian faith, of Christians, it's probably more, you could ask, as Glenn Scrivener asks, by what standard are you judging that? And where did you get that standard from? I tell you, if you start making a habit of that, it's really interesting. I don't mean to do that to other people. I mean, just do it yourself. Like, I think I should. Oh, hang on. Where did I get that standard from? We could take something like very divisive, like the voice vote. Well, it was a vote between the bad people and the people voting yes, right? But where did you get that standard from? Whichever way, and I'm not saying which way I voted. So, and it doesn't really matter. The point is, where did we get the standard by which we're making that choice? And if you're making what's perceived to be a wrong choice, where did you get the standard that you're perceiving that to be wrong? I'm hoping that makes some sense. Still on the theme of how cataclysmic the change was, this is a letter from John Dixon. This is not in Dominion. And it's a normal letter, not from a leader, not from one of those people in history that the history is written about. It's something they found, an artifact somewhere. I don't really know that. But it's a Roman centurion, a Roman soldier writing back to his wife, right? And they really, you can read some of it on the screen as well. Know that I'm still in Alexandria, get it right. And do not worry if the army sets out, I'm staying in Alexandria. I ask you to take care of the child, so presumably the first child, and if I receive my pay soon, I'll send it up to you above all. If you bear a child and it's male, let it be. If it's female, just cast it down. See how it's the assumed, it's the not special, it's the normality, the normative nature, I won't say normal, the normative nature of this, that it sounds callous to our ears, right? Yet probably more shocking to us 20 or 30 years before we have the rates of abortion and now the rates of assisted suicide. But this is shocking to us, no doubt, still. And just the first time I started to understand how foreign the ancient world was when John Dixon actually came to Seton Christian Family Centre and preached. And he preached on how humility was not a virtue in the Roman world. It was most definitely a defect. And he said you can trace the rise of humility being a virtue back for 2,000 years because it was not a virtue. So this is just to support what Tom Holland is saying. And as I said, Christian doctrine was cataclysmic. The fabric thing was rent by this concept that there's neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, male or female. It was really such an upside down world. And if you consider that the cross, first time I heard this, I found it jarring, but I think it's so familiar to us, it doesn't jar us, but it should, would be my argument, that the cross was such a symbol of Roman projection of power and of shame and of superiority. And somehow within 300 years, that goes to being, long before Constantine had it on his shields, it goes to being a symbol of redemption, of suffering, of hope, of overcoming suffering from the powerless. This is a staggering reality to Tom Holland. And actually to me, if we think about it, that image is by Daly 3. I said, can you give me a soldier with the crucifixion? Had no problem with that. But I'll show you the problem. One had a problem with it a little while ago. Worth pointing out, listen to a great debate with Tom Holland and A.C. Grayling, philosopher A.C. Grayling. And A.C. Grayling was arguing that no, the church has just been a complete impediment to progress, to morality. It's been a bad thing. Oh, look, later on, some of the monks did preserve some of the things, but that was after they burnt most of the things, including, burned down the library in Alexandria, etc. And we at Reasonable Faith here in Adelaide got that from Matt Gray and the historians years ago. That was, he said, Tom Holland is also an agnostic, but he said that A.C. Grayling's being taken in by Edward Gibbon and Gibbon by Voltaire. And these themes from Edward Gibbon, the rise and fall of the Roman Empire, I think, and these themes are adopted uncritically in memes, quote Richard Dawkins, meme theory, and really they're propagated via news shows and I guess even in Australia now in our pubs and clubs, and because this is ubiquitous, the air we breathe is secularism. And Holland did claim that A.C. Grayling was being sucked in. Now, to get a flavour of this, of Holland being an agnostic as well, there's an Australian scholar, Tim O'Neill, who runs a website and a YouTube channel called History for Atheists. And he's a staunch atheist. He's actually anti-Christian. He thinks we're dumb. And he really can't handle it when his fellow atheists are even dumber, sort of to paraphrase Tim O'Neill. But he does a really good job of the history. And he is on the unbelievable No, not the unbelievable. The Surprising Rebirth of Faith in God podcast that I talked about last time, saying exactly that. And if you go and read his website, he just can't handle the unscholarly work and the, if you like, fooling yourself about the origins of some of our values. So let's get on to a history and a flavour of some of the arguments. So I asked for a picture. I asked Daly 3. Something's happening here. Something going wrong. I asked Daly 3 for a picture of a Roman soldier standing over a poor person. Sorry, we can't do that. We don't want to show scenes of violence and cultural, that might call cultural distress. So I guess they're just being really thoughtful to all Romans, which is laudable, I guess. Anyway, look, here's one of the observations from, so we're starting to get into just a couple of examples. Charity and care for the poor was not Greek or Roman culture. Lepers and slaves are not the most defenseless of God's children. But you know, across the Roman world, wailing at the sides of the roads on rubbish tips, babies abandoned by their parents were a common sight, as we saw that with the attitude of Hilarion there writing to his wife. Caring guy, obviously cares for his wife and his son, but if it's a daughter, just throw it out. Others might be dropped down in drains to perish in the hundreds. And of course, it was Jewish and Christian practice to look after the weak. But in Judaism, it was Jewish. It was sort of walled off. And one of the points that Holland makes is that really part of what Christianity did was to universalise the care for widows and orphans. It was no longer a Jewish thing. It became universal for everybody. And of course, you know, no slave nor free, etc., male or female. And yeah, the brothels were full of women. They would get them off the rubbish dump. I'm going slowly, so I'm gonna have to speed up a little bit. And here's a great example from the book of what Holland says, that people are objecting to Christianity or fighting Christianity and fighting Christendom using the values of Christendom. And after Constantine, I think there was another emperor. Remember, I'm not the historian, Tom Holland is, so don't shoot me. And then there was Julian the Apostate, who went back to the pagan gods of Rome. And he actually despised Christianity, even though he was raised a Christian. Hang on, that sounds like a modern story. But anyway, he basically wanted to stop the church. He wanted to thwart the church. And here is what I think is a great piece of irony. He writes, I can't remember who this letter was to, but how shameful, this is Julian, Emperor Julian, writing to somebody in the administration, perhaps, how shameful our own people lack support from us when no Jew ever has to beg. Isn't that interesting? And so he wanted the Roman state to actually start doing what the church was doing, so that then people he would diminish the influence of the church. So he's using the Christian approach, which was but devoid of the Christian meaning, devoid of the story of the powerful sacrificing for the rich. So what's the, yeah, you can read the quote in the brown there. The young emperor, sincere though he was in the hatred of Galilean teachings and in regretting their impact on all that he held most dear, was blind to the irony of his plan. I thought that was just such a great example of supporting Holland's thesis. And again, it's evidence of that. It's a recurring theme. So what are some great examples? Macrina, elder sister of Basil and and Basil the Great and Gregory, who I think went on to become Pope Gregory of Nyssa, 327 AD, they would get the girls. This is where orphanages, ironically, come from. This is the genesis of looking after those at your cost, right? Of taking in, I mean, this is the first feminist revolution, right? We'll touch on that a bit more. And it certainly is the genesis of, or in the early church, of people sacrificing themselves for the poor. That is not a Roman, that is not a Greek thing. And Basil the Great, John Dixon in his book goes on to show how Basil really, sister to Macrina, was established the first hospitals. It was essentially a working hospital. It wasn't called by that name, but that's essentially what it was. Now we're moving on for care from the poor to the first feminist revolution. Again, I said this is contemporary, even though it's historical, right? This is how we got here. And when I started reading about Roman sexuality and Roman families, it is otherworldly. Essentially, Romans would relieve themselves, Roman males, of course, would relieve themselves into anybody that was of lower position than themselves. Of course, slaves, but largely anybody that was of lower position. And then what Nero did, but Roman women were largely protected, being Roman citizens, and they had some status and protection until Nero decided that he'd have some fun. And he had this great party, celebration, where he said that even the aristocrats' daughters and wives were now available. It's Nero. You couldn't exactly resist, right? You couldn't actually take that to the local police station and say, hey, you couldn't go to the ABC and say, I've got a complaint here, let's get this out. There was no Me Too movement, is what I'm trying to say, right? So by depriving aristocratic women of what they saw as their birthright, he was showing even more and projecting even more of his power and his lusts. Power rules. Holland argues pervasively that Christianity changed the West, because this is not the way we think now. A deviancy, this is worth reading. Deviancy to the Romans was preeminently a male allowing himself to be used as though he were a female. By the way, I make no apologies to this. This is history, right? This is history, but it's also not, as we'll cover in a minute. Paul, by condemning the master who casually spent himself inside a slave boy, no less than the man who offered himself up to oral and anal penetration, had imposed upon the patterns of Roman sexuality a thoroughly alien paradigm, one derived in large part from his upbringing as a Jew. Of course, we know he was. So what happens as we become more secular is a reasonable question. Andrew Tate, anybody? Is that the direction we're heading in? And I'm not being flippant when I ask that question, and you'll see why in a minute. And here's the thing. We've grown up in an era where we think that marriage was just limiting for women, right? There was no AFLW, how unfair, right? And restraint from men was seen as ungodly. And this is very much Rousseau and the Enlightenment thinking that the state of nature, if we didn't have all these archaic restrictions on us, then we'd all just be nice and good people, right? And everything would be fine. Yeah, well, it wasn't, that doesn't really gel with the history of the old world. Consent, not coercion, preached the church, was the only proper foundation of marriage. Marriage in the Roman world, I came to understand, was like a business. So you had your wife, and then you had the rest of the organisation, your slaves, your concubines, your underlings running the business. And a woman who went off and had another guy, she was risking her life. but a man who was just accepted that, as we saw, there was no separate word for urinal or ejaculation in the Roman world. It was all the same, and there were often the nouns used for women was the same as used for the urinal. Okay, this is the world we're talking about. What changed? Christian saints. Most repellent of all, said Saint Boniface, constant menace amongst those ignorant of Christ's love and laws was the proclivity for incest, which we also know was part of the Roman world. So consent, which we still value today, Holland argues, had its origins in the Christian world. So this is why I'm calling it the first feminist revolution. And Muslims, just to give the uniqueness of Christianity, Muslims whose license to enjoy a variety of wives and slaves was sanctioned directly by the Quran itself, had viewed the church's insistence on monogamy with amused bewilderment. And yeah, I'm going to move on a little bit. Louise Perry, we met in my last talk, feminist, staunch feminist. She sees and makes the case that Christian ethics are advantageous for women, vastly advantageous. And she's written a book called The Case Against the Sexual Revolution, which I haven't had a chance to read, but which I'm interested in reading. And she still can't get herself across the line to believe in the reality of Christianity, though. But she sees its goodness. And that's an interesting thing in the modern world. So I want to bring us right up to date. Researchers and law enforcement know the very strong correlation between early age porn use. So essentially, the earlier the kids start using porn, the more and more likely they're going to be a producer and user of what we call child sexual abuse material. I say we. I'm actually part of the Adelaide University team. I'm a visiting fellow in the Department of Criminology. We're using AI to try and actually find abusers on the dark net, and we're working with the Australian Centre to Counter Child Exploitation. And you can see some of their gear. I really highly recommend. If there are any parents here, any grandparents, pastors, teachers, you've got to start getting aware of the dangers of what's happening as the effect of Christendom wanes, and the technology pervades, our kids becoming more and more at risk and damaged. And just for street cred, I included a paper that we did for the AFP, which is being picked up by some of the law enforcement around Australia and beyond. We did it in partnership with the University of San Jose and actually with Purdue, and trying to actually see how to use cloud and modern technology to fight the modern technology that the abusers are using. And very, very relevant to our discussion of Roman sexuality and where we got our values from is the serious attempts to normalise pedophilia. Tom Holland points out, and there's a TED talk here. Yes, in this episode of the surprising rebirth of belief in God, there is a really good history of where we get the term and the outrage on pedophilia. So there is a very big and significant online effort to normalise pedophilia. Now, I hear people, if somebody watches this and they're secular and stuff, please don't hear a slippery slope argument. That's why I was trying to give you some street cred, and I'm talking about the ACE, Australian Centre to Counter Child Exploitation. We had a conference this time last year at Adelaide Uni. We had people from European Union. We had all of the the law enforcement. We had the entire jacket here from SAPOL and many others, experts, and it's not a slippery slope argument, it's a current affairs argument. Okay. Violence against women is becoming more and more consumed, and it is really quite incredible how much of the stuff that our kids are consuming from around about age 10 is violent and depicts violence against women. I see the ads from our government saying we should have a conversation with our kids. Yeah, we should have a conversation with them about kicking them off porn and getting rid of the porn, but it's so ubiquitous. Don't believe it from the church. Here's an ABC. Racist, sexist, racist, violent and normal. 73% of kids agreed that porn was degrading to women and showed aggression and violence. And sadly, there's only a slight difference within the church. Things are changing massively. Are we becoming more Roman because of technology? Porn, ubiquity, acceptance and influence. You go to church, you can look at your pastor and know that he's probably struggling with porn. You can look at the people around you and know that they're probably struggling. We need to start having conversations and helping. There's the porn phenomenon is the latest research from Barna on this, and it's pretty depressing when you consider how much damage it's doing and how little we're talking about it, including how much damage it's doing to our women and girls, physically as well as emotionally, when our girls are thinking what they see, what the boys are seeing is normal. Ask the emergency department of your local hospital. Right. There's a reason I started with a joke, guys. This is real. This is actually real, right? Slavery and abolition is the other one. There's a great deal of shame that the church rightfully gets, parts of the church rightfully get, from things like the slave Bible, the cotton fields in the south, some of the islands in the Bahamas, etc. And I'm going to move on a little bit, so I won't labour. But Gregory of Nyssa started talking about this in the 4th century. And to quote Rowan Williams, it's a mistake to imagine the push to end slavery in the 18th and 19th century was a secular project opposed to a religious one. There was religion on both sides, to be sure, and shamefully. The difference is the arguments against slavery were almost entirely religious or quasi-religious, whereas the arguments for slavery were economic, scientific and pragmatic as well as religious. And that's from Bullies and Saints, but it's well attested in Dominion as well. I just thought that was a really good quote. As well, it's not a European, it's not an American, it's not a Christian, a Jewish tradition. It's existed forever, but actually it was a major part of the Ottoman Empire. And again, and I'm not trying to pick on Islam, I'm trying to contrast, it's actually not really opposed in the Quran, according to the historians that I'm reading. Right? Somebody has an opposite. But the slave markets in Africa for the African slave trade were huge, but very much unwritten about in our modern West, because it's not culturally normal to actually talk about Islam in those terms. So here's a great quote. After the end of the slave trade in the UK, the Brits did police the sea. They tried. Certainly, there's areas where they weren't effective, but they actually tried to abolish slavery, and it was abolished in Europe long before it was abolished in the New World, right? But I thought this quote was actually really interesting. Once the Ottoman Empire power started to diminish, they started to put more and more pressure on the Ottoman rulers to actually ban slavery. And it was the growing bafflement of Muslim leaders, British to the bafflement of the Muslim leaders, failed to leave the question alone. And but a decade later, and I'm skipped over some there for time, when the Sultan found himself confronted by a devastating combination of military and financial crisis, British support came with a predictable price, and that was the abolition of the slave trade. These are things that don't really feature in our modern talk shows, in our modern conversations, at our feminist conventions. I'm going to have dinner with a very close friend tomorrow night who's a feminist just coming back from Constantinople. So that was almost my tribute slide for tomorrow night's conversations. But it's a thing of the past, right? Here's what I'd love to do to my friends, my many friends who rightly criticise church and have slavery as an impediment to maybe investigating faith a bit further. It's going, I have good news for you. You can get involved in freeing slaves today because there's about 45 million people working in indentured servitude and actually working in modern slavery and sex slaves. An international justice mission who, by the way, have prayer and silent time at the start of every day in their offices around the world, right? Mission they take very seriously. This is a Christ-focused organisation. It's also one of the largest anti-slavery organisations today. So if you're really offended by slavery, go to a Freedom Sunday at your local church or get behind IJM and learn how they're actually helping to free abused and sexually enslaved kids today. All right, I'm going to move on. Human rights. Most people in the West believe in human rights, but the human rights don't exist objectively. They're as fantastical as believing in angels. I heard this and I went, oh my gosh, that's actually probably true. Like we have, and it gets worse because a very famous and very influential atheist, Yuval Noah Harari, Homo Deus and Sapiens, and he's got a new book, right? He was up there with the 4 or 5 horsemen of the new apocalypse, right? The new atheists. And human rights, just like God and heaven, it's just a story we've invented. They're not objective reality. They're not some biological effect about Homo sapiens. And he goes on to say, if you cut open a human being, and I have said this in my last talk, but it's worth repeating, if you cut open a human being, you'll find the liver, the spleen, the heart, but you won't find any rights. It's a story. And he actually goes on to say in this TED talk that it's actually a Christian story. So there's another atheist actually supporting what Tom Holland is proposing. Science also has Christian origins. I would love to tell you more about Charlemagne and how he promoted science and stuff, but along with many more examples in the book, modern science had ancient Christian roots. We've got one of the scientists, and it just escapes me, and I didn't look it up, sorry. One of the quantum physicists, I think it was, said it regarded science as thinking God's thoughts after him. Who was it? It was Kepler, was it? Yep, there we go. Thank you. And Tom Holland discusses how Islam he found, and he's written a couple of books on Islam, The Sword and the Shield, I think, and something or other else. And he said it's less alien, but still very alien to the modern Western mind and culture. E.g., just look at women in Afghanistan, right? And potentially we're all watching Syria, aren't we, to see what happens there. He talked about the influence today of the Eastern Empire, the influence and the way we went down the communist route. And of course, you've got to talk about Nietzsche, who said, if you're really, Nietzsche made the same comment. If you haven't given up on looking after the poor, and if you still want to actually promote the weak and the individual, and he said, you're basically still Christian. Holland is sort of just updating Nietzsche's main theories. So what's the summary? Again, if secular humanism, and now we're going to touch a little bit more on the truth aspect, right? That was all the influence, whether it was right or wrong. This is how we got here, all right? I'm just trying to give you a flavour of how Holland is arguing we got here, right? But if secular humanism, I'm going to try that once more. If secular humanism derives not from reason or from science, but from the distinctive course of Christianity's evolution, a course that, in the opinion of growing numbers in Europe and America, has left God dead, then how are its values anything more than a shadow of a dead corpse? And of course, he's actually echoing Nietzsche there with the madman. God is dead and we've killed him. We've done the greatest of all deeds. What ceremonies will we, and I'm paraphrasing parts of the poem from Nietzsche, the madman. And surely he's in accord. And it was great in this debate between Tom Holland and A.C. Grayling arguing that our values came from the Roman and Greek world. There was a part where Justin Brierley, hosting the debate, asked A.C. Grayling, well, have you got any other questions? And he says, yes, could you name one thing? He said, I've racked my brain. I can't think of a single thing that Christianity has brought us. And I couldn't help but think, well, maybe aqueducts, maybe healthcare. And sorry if nobody here is familiar with Monty Python, but that is a very famous scene from the life of Brian. What have the Romans ever done for us? Was like A.C. Grayling was going, what have the Christians ever done for us? And Tom Holland really took him to task. And there's actually the excerpt from that conversation. And it's actually from John, sorry, no, that's not the X. This is a comment from John Dixon about that conversation. Okay, so he was on a subsequent podcast with Tom Holland, and they were commenting on the debate with A.C. Grayling. A.C. Grayling, Tom Holland debated, Justin Brierley, Tom Holland, and John Dixon commenting on that debate. And essentially, John Dixon makes this really good observation. There's nothing wrong with the Christian music. It's just that a lot of the time Christians, we don't play it very well. But I have to tell you, when we do play it well, it's sublime. And that's a different talk. But yeah, what have they done for us? University education for all, not just for the rich. That's why libraries are library. Libere means free in Latin, right? Hospitals, caring for the poor, lifelong monogamous marriage. Now, that may not be seen as a positive these days by our wider culture, but I've given you a flavour of the argument Holland makes for how powerful and uplifting that was for women. And I've shown you how with some modern secular feminists are starting to see the value in that. Rights for women, science we've mentioned. I'm almost done, but I'm going to beg your patience for another 5 minutes because I think we started 5 minutes long. Other observations that Tom Holland has made, either in discussion about Dominion or in Dominion, and some of these floored me. Some of these I had to go for a walk afterwards and think about. And I would really encourage you to do likewise. The arguments levelled at Catholics by Protestants have largely been utilised by atheists, modern and not so modern, to quote Leonard Long, and his reasonable faith presentation years ago, and Long, yes, thanks. And his by atheists, modern and not so modern, against not just the church but also Christianity. And this is something that I heard Tim Keller talk about once, so maybe this is why it jarred me when I was reading it and hearing it from Tom Holland. And then he makes this other comment. The problem is that Christianity has been too successful. Basically, everybody's accepted the Sermon on the Mount. They've accepted that we should look after the weak, the poor, the outcast. They've accepted the parable of the Good Samaritan and of the whole God, you know, the most powerful becoming lowly and actually giving for everybody. Like, it's been so successful that actually our governments have taken on all of the things that the church used to do. Hospitals, care for the poor, right? Increasingly, these are things that we expect our government to do. And he also said in a conversation on another podcast, sorry, I should have the reference there, and he said modern Christianity probably died on the Somme, with Christian nations, Christendom, fighting each other. That's a heck of an observation. I think it's more complicated than that. But I think that's a big element of how we got here in the last 80 or 90 years anyway. And Holland asked, what does the church do now? That's also a pretty good question. His answer, stay strange. And I have to tell you, I'm hearing a lot of stuff where young men in particular are joining orthodoxy. They're going to churches, Jordan Peterson talks about this, they're going to churches that are ultra-conservative where it actually asks something from them. And I'm just about out of time, but the secular pushback is muted. But something really, really struck me with A.C. Grayling and Tom Holland arguing. A.C. Grayling made this at 38:30 on the video, and you can look it up, History and Christianity. Just look for Holland and A.C. Grayling. And Grayling says the idea of cosmopolitanism, we are all equal, we're all the same, we're all part of the same world, and this, which he was arguing, comes from the Greeks and the Romans. Long before Christianity, he's arguing, from the Stoics, etc. And he said this places obligations on us to look after each other. And I'm like, I had to listen to it 3 times. How? He's a philosopher. By what authority does the fact that we're sharing the same pool put any restrictions or duties on any of us? Who says? Like, that's just a huge leap, and it's an illogical one. Why would the humble and the powerful and the comfortable, especially if you die, you rot, why would they give up power? And maybe that's what we're seeing in our modern world. All right. So if Holland's correct, as we abandon Christianity, what should we start to see? Return to more pagan sexuality, increase in the discarding of children. Consider the popularity of recently of late-term abortion, and more recently abandoning of those kids that survive abortion. Decrease in, and I'm saying popularity, right? Because even if you make laws against it now, it's actually gone up in the US since the end of Roe versus Wade, right? It's something that our culture wants. Decrease in protections of the vulnerable. The UK disability bill, where every rights or disability rights group opposed it, and it still got through. Decrease in rich government aid to nations, and a rise in ideology that Nietzsche described, perhaps including anti-Semitism. My point is that we're seeing a lot of these things, right? If we're honest with ourselves, and if the secular atheists are right, and Christianity has just been bad, then there's no God. What does it just mean except boo Christianity, boo murder? You know, if we're uttering that something is bad, it's just an utterance. It's like, so what? I mean, that's called emotivism. I gave a talk on it a number of years ago, but it doesn't actually mean anything. And again, I like this quote, this tweet from Tim Keller, from Vladimir Solovyov. You know, if man descended from apes, secular humanism is a belief that man descended from apes by a process of the powerful devouring the weak, Therefore, we should love each other. That's as realistic as A.C. Grayling's argument. And I'm just going to wrap up. So if we look at what we tried to summarise 2 talks ago about the beliefs of scientific naturalism, you can't prove scientific naturalism is true. You can't prove God is true, exists, and Christianity is true. But what you can do is these 5 things. Ask if your faith is livable is one of them, right? And let's test whether we're actually living in 2,000 years of Christian heritage. So conclusions, I'm really grateful for Tom Holland's work, his honest approach. I'm really glad he's sceptical. I think that provides a credibility because he's debating A.C. Grayling and saying, yeah, but we share the same worldview, which was really interesting. And I hope I've demonstrated, or at least given a flavour for this is not just history, it's actually current affairs. Glenn Scrivener, look up the woke, the anti-woke and the whole new world. He refers to Tom Holland's Dominion and he shows that how we've sort of turned Christendom into that can of Coke with a couple of drops of poison. That's my example, not his. You know, for agnostic and skeptical friends, I really invite you to overlook, you know, that hypocritical Christian that you know. And up here, that angry Christian, yep, that's former me, or at least much more former me. And the Christian with the politics that you describe, well, that's probably, that you despise, well, you know, for 50% of the world, that's probably still me. And consider what Justin Briley asks, and I highlighted in the previous talk, are we actually living in a larger story? And do our very selves need to know and start recognising that larger story? And then start to examine your worldview and your assumptions and risk asking if it's borrowing from Christianity. And really, that Tom Holland is making the case for in Dominion. And hopefully, if you do that, you'll find that historians like John Dixon, gracious Christians like John Dixon, humble, people like Tom Holland, unbroken. He is broken if you listen to how some of his story. And Tim O'Neill, atheist Tim O'Neill, History for Atheists. They're actually making it intellectually possible to revisit the story of Christianity in light of our 2,000 years of history. And for Christian brothers and sisters, reminder to self, we're called to love. No, I wasn't going to do this. Hang on. Hang on. Forget that first bit. I decided I wasn't going to do it. I recommend the book because it helped me equip me with tools for dialogue on the good and the bad of the church with those who see the world differently. And here's my encouragement. I got this from Carl Trueman in The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self. And the task of the Christian is not to whine about the moment in which he or she lives, but to understand its problems. Maybe that's tech, maybe that's pornography, maybe that's a misunderstanding of his, and to respond appropriately to them. Thank you. Sorry I went so far over time, but thank you for your patience. I'm done.
Yeah, so could you grab a chair?
Do you want me to turn this mic off?
You leave that on. We do have to.
All right, okay.
Pass this around to other people and then you can keep that.
Yeah. So,
Oh, really? We got a lift, huh?
Start from the end.
I think it used to work.
Right.
This
You got a lift.
they joined.
They joined. Here.
Tom Holland.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Would you like to come here? Because
Drink a beer. There you
so
go.
you just see the people on Zoom. Yeah, I welcome now people from Zoom, and so we can actually talk to each other. So has anybody got some questions or comments that they would actually like to make to Tom? Both in Zoom land and also here. Would you like to come here?
I was just struck by the statement, we hold these truths to be self-evident, which was kind of like put down because there's no such thing as self-evident truths that you can demonstrate are self-evident. That was the idea that was coming through. And reflecting on that statement in the, is it the American, behind the American Constitution or whatever, and wondering where that perception of self-evident truths come from. And, you know, the thesis here is that it comes from a whole lot of people living out of a relationship with what's with Jesus, with God, with what's the scripture, etc. Because it's like, can you find those things without the source? And so I keep coming back to what's the point of Christian values, which are not sustainable without the source? We'll just hold them up as values. And as values, they're just as good as any other values.
Or as bad.
Or as bad. So an emphasis on, well, you know, we're coming back to the core values and isn't this great? To me, doesn't cut much. That's just my reflection and comment on the sort of thrust of the idea that, oh, this is good. The West is coming back to find its true values. Because why they're just self-evident values or values that we want to hold. So there's a whole lot of the new values which do agree with the teachings in the Bible, and there's a whole lot of other areas where we depart. Have we made much progress?
I've got to
Forget the last part. That's not really my question. It was really a comment.
No, let me respond. Let me respond. I tried to clarify this to start with. For most of that talk, I wasn't talking about the truth or falsity. And certainly in my last talk, we posed that very question. And I posed it again here. If it's true, if it's not true, does it matter? I mean, if it's not true, then is anybody valuable? If we're just molecules in motion, right, responding to external stimuli, then it's just fashion and it can change. So it's meaningless, right? And so if I gave the impression that I was rejoicing because, you know, we've 2,000 years of Christian history, I'm just trying to present this shouldn't be a stumbling block to people who have not heard about this actual history, to raising the questions. But if it's not true, yeah, who cares? Bloody hard, dude. We die, we rot.
I think Tom Holland's thesis there relates to what Tom Daly was saying early on about the goldfish in water. That we hold these truths self-evident because we've just been swimming in this water for so long. We don't know anything else. Yeah.
The focus is on where they're coming from.
And Tom Holland specifically said that if someone had said to someone in the Roman world, we hold these truths to be self-evident, they would say, what? No, we don't.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And actually, I've been listening to some history about that as well. And this is a very contested area from the US Constitution and stuff. But it was apparently it's well agreed. I was even listening to Michael Shermer, head of the UK Humanist Society, and former author, editor of the Skeptic magazine in the UK, and he's a very erudite man, and has a lot of his logic in a row, but he has, I believe, the same blind point as I pointed out with AC Grayling. But even he agreed that it was Benjamin Franklin who altered the words to be, we hold these truths to be self-evident. The wording before Benjamin Franklin got involved was sacred and true. Yeah, and all the atheists actually agree. That there seems to be a good consensus on that. But he wanted to make it more a deist than and of course, what was he doing? And when was that? Oh, there was a little bit of a fracas going on in France. So he was over there in the middle of the French Revolution. So hardly surprising, his attitude, right?
Was he supporting the French Revolution?
I believe so, but I'm now treading in very murky waters, so I'm not going to say anything more. Can't remember. I'm not a Benjamin Franklin, although I have had really nice coffee where he used to hang out with some of the editors in the of some of the pro revolution papers and stuff like that. Some of the revolutionaries.
Can I just throw in an alternative view as to where these kind of shared values might come from? One idea is that, and it was mentioned, you talked about the logical leap from the argument from cosmopolitanism to kind of caring for one another.
Yeah.
I mean, there is some sort of sense in that as one becomes aware of a bigger world and a connection outside of oneself on a bigger scale, one becomes more challenged by wanting to be a part of something bigger. And maybe that is innate in us from an evolutionary point of view, that we have a desire to, a functional thing to look after the family unit or the social units. And as they get bigger, we kind of have to, be more accountable in some way to that drive. And an alternative to that, again, is maybe if we're made in the image of God, then maybe there are some such things as self-evident values that come out of that sense in which there is something of a conscience, a desire for justice actually inbuilt within us. And it's just, it's other things that take us away from that. So there's two other alternative ideas against the one that says this stuff has come from, Christian teaching and relationship with Jesus, etc.
Because he makes a case, all the people in history, and they're Catholic or whatever, go back to the fundamentals of what Christ said, that the weak shall inherit the earth, or they'll be the first to heaven before the priests. So, and that comes out in all of the, all the heroes that he brings into the story, Gregory, all of those people. So only briefly, and he makes the point. Oh yeah.
So that's relevant to those two arguments.
What do you mean? Sorry.
Well, if it's an evolutionary basis, that's pre-Christ. So there's a basis for having these values. It's evolutionary, and if it's made in the image of God, that is also pre-Christ.
But he makes the point that all the people who have influenced history have been driven by their faith and the teaching of Jesus about the weak shall inherit the earth, and that's the main.
Meek, actually.
Yeah, meek. Yeah. Or whatever. Well, I'm misquoting, but you know what I'm trying to say. That's the whole. Yeah, that's the whole basis that I read in reading it. All the heroes that are brought forward have always been men of faith, or not my faith, but always questioning themselves against that premise that Jesus said. And he uses he doesn't quote any Old Testament. He just quotes the words of Jesus in everything he does, and how the various heroes of the story. I think, and that's what I say, that you need to read it to understand that. I gained a great idea. I've been always wanting, I like history and read up on it. That he gave me some of the characters I've never heard of, but I now want to explore those. So he does cover the whole sweep of the 2000 years very well. All the influences from humanists to whoever.
Sorry.
Sorry. Yeah. Okay. Go on.
So the first question was, maybe we got here because there's an evolutionary advantage in being good to each other. Is that summarise it?
Very simplistic, yes. yes.
Yeah.
As
So,
we
yeah,
bigger world, connected world.
but there's a few problems with that from evolutionary theory. You know, the first one is DNA neither knows nor cares. It just is, and we dance to its tune. That's the first one. And the second problem is the nicely captured in that quote from Solovyov, and that's you're making an assumption there that the powerful aren't preying on the weak. What would be the evolutionary value of the power? Where's the evolutionary theory that says that the powerful don't prey on the weak? It's standard evolutionary theory to say that the powerful do prey on the weak. And there's a great quote by it's just it's on the tip of my tongue about. Oh, no, I'm not going to be able to produce it, sorry. But essentially how lucky we are to get here, mostly by hook or by crook, through a process of you know, the dinosaurs being wiped out. So somebody as weak, a species as weak as we could actually flourish, because if the dinosaurs were still around, would be mincemeat, that sort of thing.
Evolution sees that would have those things in tension, like mothers have to care for their children. That benefits.
Well, that's as long as their husband doesn't tell them to throw them down the well and get rid of them.
These things are tension.
But how has that got anything to do with evolution? Evolution is very strongly predicated on the weak, on the.
Not caring for your offspring.
You don't survive.
You don't leave as many offspring. That's as much part of evolution as fighting to actually assert oneself in the world. Those two things have to be in tension.
So
That's not evolution.
So the idea that communities that
evolution works through that stuff.
Communities that look after each other will flourish better than communities that don't look after each other. That I guess.
Tribes combined.
Why are mothers biologically endowed to care for their children at the cost of themselves? Of course it's evolution.
how do you explain then the kid's just discarded in evolutionary terms?
Well, these, you know, it's not a perfect fit. These things are in tension, but there is innate in us that desire for care. It's built in.
Are you not now projecting and doing exactly what Tom Holland says, projecting a Christian worldview back onto the Roman culture and applying evolution to that?
I believe I'm arguing from an understanding of evolutionary theory that says this actually makes sense.
But the Greeks and the Romans would discard their kids.
So
Yeah.
evolution's not perfect. You've got parasites, you've got all sorts of things going on. But within that, care is part of it.
You think that the ways the Romans treated their
it's what works to leave more offspring.
yeah.
You put values on it, sure. And we interpret these things as values, but part of our inbuilt humanity from an evolutionary understanding is care. It's to discard that and say that we're all just totally about just individual achievement.
So well then, okay. All right. So let's park that one.
Can I just add something?
Yeah.
As far as I understand it, Christianity has a emphasis on caring for the vulnerable and the weak, so that a society's what would you say this how well a society is doing from a Christian point of view depends on how they look after their disabled or vulnerable citizens, you know, children, all that. In nature, if you look at nature, my daughter helps look after rescue koalas, but often they'll find an abandoned, I think it's an abandoned joey koala, and they'll try to nurse it and look after it, but they're very delicate. And often, you know, 90% of the time they die. They're much harder to rear than kangaroo joeys. but the mother may have been already sick, and the mother abandons them because they know that. So that's from an animal point of view. The young are abandoned if they are sick or injured, and they move on to have more. But from a Christian point of view, our young or sick or disabled, we don't abandon, and we do the opposite. You know, we as an act of service to God, we look after that child. And for some people, that could be for 50 years, you know. So Christianity turns an evolutionary idea of young, you know, be looking after a young, nurturing, on its head. All right, because a natural, from an evolutionary point of view, you abandon or you disregard a disabled or injured child, or, you know, and go on to the next one. But from Christian point of view, we don't. It's how we treat our most vulnerable is what God looks for, you know. So it's the opposite. Yeah. Anyway, that's just an opinion. But
And evolutionists would just say that the desire to care is more highly evolved in social animals,
yeah.
more social than koalas are, and most highly evolved in humans. And yeah.
And so by what authority do we need to obey that law? Oh, we're free to evolve to the next point where we can just actually ignore evolution, right?
The only authority is to say that you know, that works better. That's really the only
Who cares?
Who cares and who says?
But you look at China and secular societies like Russia, or I suppose China, they're encouraged to abandon their children or disabled children.
Or not now.
Um,
Not now. Not
No.
now.
Yeah.
Not now.
Yeah.
Not now.
No, they realise they did the wrong thing. They're running out of population to work.
Yeah.
Oh, right, okay. Well,
They're in precipitous
you know.
decline.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
Can I just butt in? We all love to quote Gibbons, oh, rise and fall of the Roman Empire. He must have wrote the original truth on that. Absolutely wrong. Go back to Augustine, the city of God. There was criticism of Christianity right back then, what, 410, when I think Rome fell. And you're quite right, in the city of God pointed out that was the Huns, I think it was, who captured Rome. The one place that they left sacrosanct, and which Romans, non-Christian Romans, fled to, were Christian churches. Those churches were regarded as sacrosanct by the Huns, and the Romans, atheists as they were, fled there because they knew that's where they'd be protected.
It's the barbarians or the Visigoths. Was it the Visigoths?
No, Visigoths attacked Africa.
It was
Visigoths were Africa, and it was the Huns that got Rome. Was it Africa? I think that's correct, but I've read a Dark Ages history book recently. So it was, I think it was the Huns that got Rome and the Visigoths that got all of the, well, they got Spain and Italy, but also all of North Africa.
Visigoths ruled Italy for a while.
Yeah.
From Ravenna.
Anyway, the point being, we shouldn't just rely on Gibbons. We should go all the way back to Augustine and the city of God.
Thanks, Steve. Let me clarify. I was quoting Tom Holland as having people being sucked in by Gibbons.
Yes. Okay. Yeah.
Right. I wasn't quite, and I also said that I'm actually about 3 or 4 pages into the rise and fall of the Roman Empire.
Okay. Yeah.
So I'm no Gibbon expert. I'm quoting. That's why I said I'm quoting other historians.
Sure. Oh, look. So I didn't
about Gibbon sucking them in. No, I'm agreeing. We're agreeing. I'm just trying to clarify, and thanks for the opportunity to clarify.
Can I just pull this conversation in another direction? You've spoken on the moral argument before, haven't you?
Yeah, I think we.
Yeah. So the moral argument is If God does not exist, then objective moral values don't exist. Objective moral values exist, therefore God exists.
That's it. That's
And
it.
how does that relate to kind of the fluidity of values in the ancient world, pre-Christian? So just looking at that, people do not perceive objective moral values.
If I've got one area that causes me to struggle and doubt as a Christian, it's the fact that our moral values and duties are so contested and they're not clearer. You got 100 pastors, 100 priests from different devout Christian denominations who stake their life on the resurrection. 50 will say divorce is okay, 50 will say it's not. This is something I don't feel equipped at all, because if you could show, I vacillate. If you had some flavour of this last time with the lady here who's lost her husband and her kids.
Julie.
Right, Julie. And I think it's binary. Either objective moral values and duties do exist and we're not just particles in motion, and the pains that we feel and the sufferings that we have are real and they mean something, or there's no God and we're just particles in motion and it's all just evolution from the ground up and nothing means anything. And if somebody can point me to a third way, and I haven't seen anybody give anything like a cogent argument for a third way, right? Then I would certainly look at it, but I see nothing that makes any sense.
Would you believe that there are objective moral values?
I stake my life on it. And not only that, I'd actually suggest that we should be like Pascal and take his wager, right? Because what do you got? What do you got otherwise? We've got meaninglessness, purposelessness. We've got 18-year-olds that stormed the beaches in Normandy, and they're at Yale and Purdue. They're at Stanford, and you've got girls who get called a name and they commit suicide. Same 18-year-olds. Suicide is an endemic. It's a pandemic in the richest parts of the US and in our most comfortable parts of society, right? The young guys that listen to Jordan Peterson and Andrew Tate, they're lost. So we should actually, in fact, what Augustine, thank you, Steve. I'm about a third of the way through the City of God. I keep getting distracted. What Augustine basically says is that in our apologetics, and I actually think this might be from Confessions, not City of God, but he said that what we should be doing is not showing people that Christianity is true. We should be showing them how good it is, and then maybe they'll lean in and want it to be true. This is a truth that this is something that I've been more and more trying to understand. I think, and then of course that even goes to further questions for what you're doing, Kevin, but because I think our apologetic needs to change, and I think Augustine had the key. It's got to be show people it's good and then show it's true. At the moment, you've got AC Grayling, you've got our morning shows, and hell spells, you've got enough Christians showing it's not good or suggesting it's not good, right? C.S. Lewis says that Christians make Christianity either more or less acceptable, believable, right? Gandhi said, I like your Christ, but I don't like your Christians, you know? So, yeah, I am changing. I hope even tonight, if you would compare my presentation, you would actually see a much more impassioned plea, not arguing firstly, is it good? Sorry, not arguing firstly if it's true. I left truth right to the end. Arguing this is how we got here, and actually arguing and assuming that we all agree that women are important. Kids shouldn't be abused. People shouldn't live in slavery.
It took 1,800 years. it took 1800 years after Christ and another 1900.
I haven't argued it's true so far. That's other presentations.
Interesting mention of Augustine's City of God. I have skimmed it a few years back. One of the things that came out from that is that he was constantly having a go at the old gods. And thinking about it in terms of Tom Holland's dominion, you kind of get the impression that in Augustine's time, we are goldfish, but we are still very aware that it's water around us. And we're still getting this Christian idea. We haven't quite got it yet as a society as a whole, but it is partly happening so that we can see, as Augustine tries to put across, that this Christianity is different in a good and worthwhile way compared to the old gods of Rome and Greece.
That's a good point. That's actually a really good point. And Holland does touch on Augustine a little bit in the early chapters. And you're right. It's back when paganism was the ruling idea. You could differentiate, right? And Christianity looked pretty good. How do we know that? Cross is a very different emblem than it was as it is today, and it became. All right. Leaving aside Malvian Bridge and the Crusades and stuff, but anyway, you know what I mean.
I think I'm weird. When I became a Christian, I say I always believed in God until I became a Christian. And then suddenly I had doubts. And so I went home and I wrote 14 reasons why I believed in God, and I took them to my Sunday school class next Sunday and shared it. So for me, the objective truth of the fundamentals of Christianity was crucial. Because I was not really greatly influenced by, is it good? At the time, as a 14-year-old, I was interested in objective truth. Now, sorry?
There are not a lot of people like
Oh,
us.
that's
That's why I said I'm weird.
That's us.
Yeah. But I've kind of agree with you now that a lot of people, they don't care about that sort of thing. They're more emission.
No, that's not what I was saying, Kevin. Don't mishear.
I would say a lot of people are more influenced by taste than objective truth.
I think Keller said, he sort of said there's 4 different angles that people consider. Is it, and I forget exactly what they are, but something like, is it true? Does it work? Is it right? Is it beautiful? Or I can't remember what the 4 were, but those kind of different aspects. And so different people will sort of be keen on different angles of, different apologetics are more suitable for different people.
Don't hear that truth is not fundamentally important. I'm just saying in the culture in which we live, and it's ironic that Augustine made the same argument, that we actually need to spend more time showing people it's good, and then we'll get their attention to actually to talk to whether it's true.
What's good? I mean, this is the whole problem. Good is a value judgment, and you're left with nothing to found it on. Without truth, there is nothing to found it on.
Again, what am I saying that's not coming across right? I'm not saying that truth is not fundamental. I just said that I believe in objective morality. In fact, actually, during my talk on objective morality, there was a friend of mine in Colorado. He said, I've come to understand that the belief in the good is the same, is wholly equivalent to the belief in God. And I went, and that stuck with me, because if you believe that truth, and you could expand it to the 3 transcendence, truth, beauty, and goodness, right? If you believe that those exist, right, it's so close to believing that God exists. I think believing that good exists is the same as believing that God exists.
Yes, so did
is kind of a truth
at the top?
Oh, truth is definitely at the top for me. I think, yeah, the moment you start talking about these values and put that aside, you've lost the argument.
I didn't say to put truth aside, not for a second. Not for a second. Oh, yeah, exactly. Yeah, but when I talk about football,
He was saying that's a subject for another night.
that's right. I was saying when I talk about footy, I don't talk about whether it's objectively, I talk about footy, right? Tonight's talk was on how we got to where we got. But I was also pointing out that those people who object to the idea of what the history says, right, who say that we're actually come from the Greeks and the Romans and the Stoics, I'm saying that if they're right, well, then they have a truth problem. Well, I left that right to the end. It wasn't the subject of tonight's talk.
And the subject of absolute truth or absolute morality, is it objectively real or is it always subjective? I agree with Tom on the binary situation, that either is or isn't. And now I've forgotten where I was going with that. Right.
Yeah, well, okay.
We don't all agree on what are the objective goods and bads, but we all, whether we like it or not, we stand on certain things. So we all live as if there is real objective truth.
Correct.
There is an absolute basis for morality. We cannot live without that assumption, even when we try to deny it.
That's Keller's point. And when he says, if you examine your worldview, is it livable? So for instance, we all know the fun of going to our relativists. I've got a number of relativist uni friends, right, who think that, sort of the Oprah thing, your truth and my truth. And all truth is relative. Is that true? That's as useful as saying I can't make a sentence in English. I can't use the English language. It's self-contradictory, and it's nonsense. Also widely taught in our institutions these days. I hope for we're recovering, but I'm not sure.
What about non-Western countries, say Japan, China? They have a whole pile of ethical values that influence their society.
We all do. That's the point just made. We
Yeah.
all do. The question is, are they right or are they wrong? I mean, is it wrong to actually get rid of the Uyghurs in China? Well, Chinese people don't think so. Chinese Christians do. Who's right? Truth matters.
Holland he's making a moral judgment on the value of what Christianity's brought to the fore, as opposed to the Roman lifestyle.
Yeah, he's adopting a moral position, isn't he?
He is.
Yeah.
But he's not crossed the bridge to think that it's true.
Not far
but
off
that's-
from what I've seen in recent times. Not sure.
But if you read his book, as a non-Christian or even an atheist, you start to question things. He writes it in a way that he tells the story from the point of view of the person doing it. He doesn't make any, you actually feel that person's doing it and doing it for that reason.
He's detached.
He's detached, but he's not detached.
It's a good book.
He writes that way. He writes that way.
Yeah.
And his other books, there's one on Islam as well.
Islam, the Sword and the Shield, I think it
Yeah.
is. Yeah. And actually what happened is when he started writing books, he used to write vampire stories. By the way, I mean, this is the other thing about Holland. They've got one of the largest podcasts around, right? The Rest is History. Him and Dominic. And I actually got onto it from my son. And they're as funny as fits. But it's
Not very edifying, no?
probably not. But it's hugely popular with young people. hugely popular with young people. So what our universities aren't doing, Tom Holland and Dominic Sandbrook actually do, and they have an enormous audience of young people. My wife likes listening to it, and she's not into academic or, you know, things like that. But we'll drive to Alice Springs to go and see the kids, and or you want a podcast? You choose. It's going to be something from the rest of history. So, and I think that's the other thing that gives this book significance.
Yeah, I
that
think,
plus, as
I
you're
think it
saying,
is. I think every you should recommend it to anybody, you know, really.
Yeah.
Yeah.
well, apart from 600 pages.
Oh yeah, it is hard because it's so thorough.
Oh, sorry, I thought you were recommending the rest is history.
No. And
recommend
to
that
spoil, there's one point I want to make as a joke. To spoil the ending of Gibbon's book, we are inheritors of the Romans. That is bureaucracy.
Oh, yeah, well, that's
Okay,
true.
and that's the point.
Yeah,
That's the
yeah,
final
that's
point he
true.
makes. We
Yeah,
are
yeah,
Roman
okay.
in the way we
But-
deal with, and also our judges,
Yep.
our courts are the courts and bureaucracy are the two things the Romans left us.
See what we've got today.
No, sorry,
Gibbon didn't see what we've got today.
no, but the courts, in the sense of the judges are supposed to be the Roman judges were supposed to be impartial in civil matters.
Yeah, but even so, there was Christians who basically paid for representation, and then when the church was given some access, they would have defendants, poor people would get access to the court system free.
Yes.
This didn't happen in the Roman world. There's just time after time. You read about slavery where the church was buying slaves. They accepted slavery as happening. Augustine was actually involved so much in raising funds to free slaves. This is what the Christians in Rome did. They freed the slaves.
But the Jews also kept slaves.
And the
If you won a battle,
yes,
you took the spoils of victory, and they were women and boys, and they became your servants in inverted commas.
Yeah.
They were slaves.
But they should not have been treated as the Romans treated theirs.
Who knows?
Well,
We've got
at
numbers.
least the Torah, if they were Torah observing, they should
I
not.
mean, who knows how they treated? Yeah,
How they were treated.
Yeah, that's a different
yeah,
thing.
that's what I'm saying. We've got no
Yeah, that's right.
understanding of that.
Right.
And also, what Holland is good at, he does give you the perspective of the times. In other words, we often project our modern ideas back to somebody 2000. He actually gives you the feeling of these guys believed in the supernatural, right? And he tells that story, and he'll tell the story of somebody that might have been risen from the dead that lived for 200 years, that we know is probably rubbish, but he actually tells it from the perspective, and this is from the Sword book. That person really existed in the minds of the people because they believed it. And so you actually gain a different perspective on history. He is very good at that.
So he is a historian.
Yeah, he is.
He's not a philosopher, part-time historian. He's a historian. And it's interesting, the congruence, the matching of what I was reading from him on the library in Hypatia and in Alexandria. Oh man, it just, I need to go back and look at the Reasonable Faith night with Matt Gray here, and there's just a very strong concordance. AC Grayling tells a different story, and that's where they're claiming he's being sucked in by Gibbon.
There's a book that I've just read, also written by a Muslim professor in England called Alexandria. It's a brilliant book, and he writes impartially. Yeah, okay. Too. He writes in the same vein as
he doesn't have a dog in that fight, does he? I guess he doesn't have a dog in that fight.
No, but he tells the story from the founding of Alexandria to now.
Okay. Interesting.
And again, it fills in some of the gaps.
Yeah. Okay.
And some of the knowledge, and he tells it in such a way that he's totally neutral.
You know, Borders had it right. Borders Bookshop had it right. I think they're out of business now because of Amazon, right? But their big logo in the US was so many books, so little time.
Yeah.
We have to wind up very soon, otherwise the cleaners will get really angry. So have you got, can you wind it?
How how long does it, how many generations of lots of Christians in a society before they get some of the Christian values like those we have here? There are some parts of the world where there are a large proportion of practicing Christians, a lot of countries in Africa, Philippines, a lot of other countries. Do we see the same kind of human rights and regard for the weak in those places as we do in the white countries, we might say? And if not, how long before we do see them?
That is a very good question, and
That might relate to what I was saying before about Augustine and his progression through that state.
I'm thinking of what I saw in East Timor, what I see in Africa, what I see in Alice Springs, and I'm not at all qualified to answer that question. But just what I'm saying there, that's a really good question, Aaron. Well, and the other one, the one that goes with it is the one I did pose. How long does it take to lose it? And what's the implications of losing it? I think that was the flip side, but you're asking the flip side of that question. And that's huge. And I don't know. I mean, who knows? It's a good question. You might have caught me with that one. Because I mean, I'm trying to see if I can relate some. I don't think in a short time I could relate a story fairly without proper balance. No, no. But
I've got a closing question.
Yeah, go on.
Where does it leave us now? What should we do?
That's why I put the last quote. I see a lot of us, particularly older folks. This is why I encourage everybody. You know, I've been doing this for 2 years, is to actually grab somebody younger and go and have coffee, go and have dialogue and ask them their story, ask them how they are. I find a lot of people, our Christians, outside, we're quietly comfortable in a hurting world. Right? I give you the figures on porn, right? There is no young person you know that is not affected by porn sitting in your churches. Go and ask them about it. You know what they normally say? Thank you. Somebody cares. We're rich, white and comfortable, and we've got the comfort of certainty in our churches. We need the discomfort. You know, the gospel is about afflicting the comfortable and comforting the afflicted. And if there's nothing that my last 3 or 4 talks you've heard, just hear that ours is to respond correctly to the time that we're actually in. Stop being so angry at wokeism or non-wokeism and actually start engaging people in dialogue.
Wokeism descends from Christianity as
I didn't want to go there because
that's the last chapter of the book.
Yeah, it is.
Or at least the
I
title of
think
the
what you
chapter.
put as the last.
But thank you for the question, Kevin.
Okay, thank you very much for giving your talk. And I think the conversation and discussion's been quite animated and interesting. So, right, okay. All right. At this point, I think we might terminate the recording. No, I can't do it here. Could you do it there? And so there is some time for people just to have